"I'll give you 2 million if you translate this." The millionaire laughed, but the janitor shut him up. Martha Sullivan had spent the last 6 years of her life being invisible out of necessity, not by choice. In that world of suits and ties, of decisions worth fortunes and handshakes, sealing the fate of entire companies, a woman in a janitor's uniform simply didn't exist. She was part of the decor, like the carpet or the hallway lamp. And until that Tuesday night, she had made peace with it. That's when she walked into the conference room on the 18th floor, and a document slid off the table, landing at her feet. She bent down to return it, as protocol dictated, and her eyes landed on the first few lines before she could stop herself. The tallest man in the group looked her up and down, with a grin like he was having fun, and opened a thick envelope on the money-covered table. "If you translate this entire contract from English to Portuguese, without missing a single comma, I'll give you $2 million, he said, tossing the document her way. The other men burst into laughter. Martha looked at the contract. She looked at those amused faces, and then, without a word, she picked up the document and began reading aloud. The laughter died down. She didn't stop. Sterling Harrison was 42 years old, with dark hair combed to the side with that precision of someone who leaves nothing to chance, and the kind of posture that comes from decades of being used to being the most important man in any room he enters. He wore a dark blue suit that must have cost what Martha earned in 3 months of work, and held a glass of bourbon with the ease of someone completely at home in his own territory. He had made the offer like proposing a game for a bored child, with that arrogant ease of someone who knows the joke will work, because no one on the other side can respond in any meaningful way. But Martha Sullivan was no one, even if everyone there thought she was. She had started with the first paragraph, slowly, with clear diction and a naturalness that had wiped the smile off Sterling's face within the first few sentences. Technical terms from business partnership contracts, clauses of shared liability, conditions for adjustment and termination, all flowing with the ease of someone not translating, but simply reading something already in her own language. By the second paragraph, one of the men had set down his glass. By the third, another had sat up straight in his chair. By the fifth, the room was completely quiet, with that kind of silence that weighs heavier than any noise. She reached the 7th paragraph and stopped. Not because she had made a mistake, not because she had forgotten a term or stumbled on a tricky construction. She stopped because she recognized something in the text that had nothing to do with translation. It was a structure, a specific framework within the secondary clauses, built with that technical elegance that seems innocent to careless eyes, but, for someone who has spent years studying contracts, has a signature as personal as handwriting. Total responsibility for any future irregularities was being shifted gradually, page by page, from all the main signatories to a single named figure appearing at the end of the document. A figure who would sign without knowing what they were actually taking on. Martha knew that technique. She had seen it before. At another time, in another document, but with the same invisible hand behind every word. "Continue," said Sterling, and his voice had completely lost its amused tone. She looked up from the paper and met his eyes directly. "May I ask who drafted this contract?" The silence that followed had a different quality. It was no longer surprise. It was something else. "That's none of your business," said the man with the dark-rimmed glasses standing to Sterling's left. "Is it a downtown firm?" she insisted with the same calm. "Young lady," Sterling smiled again, but this time the smile didn't reach his eyes. "You did very well, you know English, congratulations. But the game's over. You can leave the contract and get back to your job." She didn't hand over the document right away. Before setting the paper on the table, her eyes had already found what she was looking for. At the bottom corner of the last page, a small stamp with the name of the firm responsible for drafting it. Blackstone and Associates. The name hit her like a cold shiver running down her spine that wouldn't go away. She dropped the contract, grabbed her cart and left the room. None of the men said a word as she walked out. In the hallway, with the cart in front of her and her heart beating faster than she'd like, Martha Sullivan paused for a moment with her eyes closed. Her hands were steady. Inside, something that had been locked away with 7 keys for 6 long years had just been unsealed. Blackstone and Associates. She knew that name all too well. There was a ritual Martha followed every night when her shift ended. She stored the rags in the basement closet, washed her hands in the employee restroom, grabbed the old brown leather bag she'd bought on sale years ago, and left through the service entrance without speaking to anyone. It was the exit of someone who wasn't in a hurry, but also had nothing waiting outside that justified lingering. The bus at 11:20 passed in front of the building, and she always caught that one, a 23-minute ride to the neighborhood where she lived, on a quiet street of small houses, in a housing project on the other side of the city, far from downtown and the ocean and everything that glittered. That Tuesday, she stared out the bus window without seeing anything that passed by. The city paraded on the other side of the fogged-up glass, streetlights and lit-up facades and blinking yellow traffic signals, but she wasn't there. She was 6 years back. She was in a March morning that had split her life in two with the precision of a good knife. 6 years ago, Martha Sullivan wasn't a cleaner. She was a certified translator with her own company, one she'd taken nearly 10 years to build from scratch, starting with translations of technical manuals she'd delivered for next to nothing while studying for the certifications she needed. She had started in a room of the apartment where she lived with Chloe, then 12 years old, using a computer she'd bought in 18 installments. It had been slow and exhausting and sometimes very lonely. But it had worked. When the company was 5 years in, Martha had a stable client base, law firms that needed translations of international contracts, a construction company that imported equipment and needed translated technical manuals, 2 foreign trade businesses that relied on precise documentation for customs processes. She had a reputation built client by client, revision by revision, and it had reached the point where clients themselves referred her to others without her having to make any marketing effort. It was the kind of balance that takes a long time to build, and when it's ready, seems solid, seems permanent. It wasn't. One March morning, while she was preparing a translation for a new client, a message came through her professional email. It was from another client, a law firm she'd worked with for 3 years, and the tone was cold from the first line. They had received a formal notice that her registration as a certified translator was under investigation, that there was a complaint involving fraudulent documents, that as a precaution they were suspending the partnership until the matter was resolved. She had read that email 3 times, thinking there was some mistake, that she had confused the recipient, that there was some error in the name or registration that would be resolved with a single phone call. There wasn't. In the following days, the story had taken shape before her eyes, with the speed of something that was already ready and only waiting to be revealed. She had been linked to a shell company that supposedly used her registration to validate contracts with irregularities. The evidence presented was detailed and surgical. It showed copies of documents with her translator's stamp on contracts she had never seen. It showed transfers she had never made. It showed an entire operation that had existed using her name as a shield, without her knowing anything about it. She had hired a lawyer. She had presented counter-evidence. She had spent months in meetings and hearings and conversations that consumed time and money and energy she didn't have to spare without stopping work, but which she had to offer because what was at stake was everything she had built, and she had lost. Not all at once. It had been a gradual process, like the tide rising without you noticing until the water is already at your waist. Client after client closing their doors. A warning from the professional board, then another, then the formal suspension of her registration. Without registration, no possibility of signing documents. Without the possibility of signing, no service. Without service, no business. In 6 months, it was all over. Chloe was 17 years old. She needed school, she needed food. She needed a mother who was functional. So Martha had folded the cloth, put the documents in the cardboard box that went to the back of the closet, and accepted the first job that came along, which was a cleaning position through a friend of Mrs. Dorothy Campbell, her neighbor. She had accepted because she needed to, and she had stayed because, in some way she had never been able to fully explain, the silent routine had become a strange kind of shield. With that uniform, with that cart, No one expected her to be who she had once been, and for a long time, that had been enough to survive. But as the bus reached her stop that Tuesday evening, and she got off to walk the last block home, Martha knew that enough had come to an end. Blackstone and Associates, the same name, 6 years later, still operating, still drafting contracts with the same structure she had recognized. As she walked along the uneven pavement of the street, she pulled from her apron pocket the little black notebook she always carried. It was an old habit from her days as a teacher and translator that she had never managed to let go. Writing down the things her mind needed to hold on to, but that her memory sometimes betrayed. In it were technical vocabularies, German legal terms with their English equivalents, little work notes. And now, under the yellowish light of a street lamp, she opened the notebook to a blank page and began to write the name of the firm, the clauses she had identified in the contract as much as she could reproduce from memory, the specific structure, the way the liability had been shifted, the technical terms used. Her fingers moved steadily. Inside, there was a storm. But it was a storm she knew. And this time, she wasn't willing to let it pass unanswered. The house was quiet when she arrived. Chloe had left a light on in the kitchen and a note on the table. "There's burger and fries in the pot. I went to bed early. I have class early tomorrow. Love you." Martha folded the note carefully and placed it in her apron pocket, which she still hadn't taken off. Chloe was 23 years old and in her second year of accounting at a private university in the city, paying the tuition with a part-time job at a hardware store in the neighborhood. She would wake up at 6, head to the store at 7:30, leave at 12:30, grab something quick to eat, catch the bus to college, attend 3 classes, and get back around 10 at night. Every day, Monday through Friday. Martha had watched her daughter build this routine over the last 2 years, with a mix of admiration and regret that she had never been able to sort out within herself. Admiration, because Chloe had created that structure with a determination that no one had needed to teach her. Regret, because no child should have to grow up like that in such a hurry, with so little room for error. She heated up dinner, sat at the table, and stared at her plate. Then she opened the little notebook and reread what she had written on the way home. There was a question she couldn't stop asking herself, one that had come to her in the hallway on the 18th floor and had been growing inside her the whole trip back. If Blackstone and Associates was drafting contracts with that specific structure 6 years after what had happened to her, were there other people who had gone through what she had? And if there were, where was the proof? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Over the next 3 days, Martha went to work as if nothing had changed. It was a conscious decision, though not fully articulated. There was something instinctive in the way she had decided to keep everything exactly the same. The same arrival time, the same route through the building, the same discreet posture, the same way of entering each room, doing the work, and leaving without a trace of presence beyond the clean floor and the organized bathroom. But the 18th floor was different, not in an obvious way. The rooms were still in the same places, the same pictures on the walls, the same plants in the corners. But the door to the meeting room, which used to stay ajar during business hours and which Martha had barely noticed for years, was now always closed. And the documents she used to see scattered on the tables when she went in to clean had disappeared, replaced by empty surfaces that suggested the important things were being put away before she arrived. Sterling Harrison had noticed her. She didn't need explicit confirmation to know that. It was the kind of thing a woman learns to pick up on after years in a position where everyone ignores you. When people suddenly stop ignoring you, the change hangs in the air like a different smell. On Thursday of the same week, she was mopping the hallway near the meeting room when she heard voices behind the closed door. She wasn't trying to listen. She was just doing her job, with the mop on the floor and her head turned toward the wall. But the building had the tricky acoustics of long hallways, which carry sound in a way the architects probably hadn't accounted for. And the name that reached her made her stop for a split second. Blackstone. That was enough. She kept walking, slowly, at the same pace as always, But the word had gotten inside her and stayed there, small and solid, like a fragment of something that will keep hurting until it's removed. It was Chloe who first noticed that something had changed in her mother. They had dinner together 3, maybe 4 times a week, depending on Chloe's college schedule. It was the time they had to really see each other, not just cross paths in the kitchen while one was coming in and the other was leaving. And on that Friday night, sitting at the table with the fan spinning in the corner and the burger and fries still hot, Martha had been quiet for too long to be normal. Chloe put down her fork. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Nothing. I'm tired." "It's not tiredness." Chloe knew her too well for that. "You have that look you get when you're thinking about something you don't want to talk about." Martha stared at her plate for a moment. There was a calculation she had been making internally since Tuesday. How much to say, who to tell, when to say it. Chloe was 23, overwhelmed with work and college, and had spent the last 6 years building a life on top of what was left after her mother's life had fallen apart. Bringing all of that back had a weight that Martha needed to assess before placing it on her daughter's shoulders. But Chloe was also the person she trusted most in the world, and carrying it alone was already getting too heavy. "Something happened at work," she finally said. She told it carefully, not all at once. She started with the bet, the document in English, the translation, the silence that had fallen over the hall as she read. Chloe listened without interrupting, her elbows on the table and her face slightly tilted forward, in that posture she had developed since she was little, when something truly deserved attention. "And the name of the firm?" she asked when Martha paused. "Blackstone and Associates." Chloe's expression shifted subtly. She had been 15 when the scandal happened, but she had followed it closely enough that the name was etched in her memory. "Are you sure?" "I saw the stamp with my own eyes." Chloe was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up, went to her room, came back with the laptop open, and placed it on the table, carefully pushing the plates aside. "Tell me everything you remember about the contract," she said, sitting back down. "The structure, the terms, what you recognized. Chloe, you have an exam on Monday." "Mom, tell me." Martha spent the next hour and a half describing what she had seen and heard. Chloe took notes on a pad, did some searches, went back to ask for details. It was almost midnight when she looked up from the screen with an expression Martha couldn't fully read. "What is it?" Martha asked. "The firm has an active and clean registration. No public issues. Nothing that shows up in a basic search." Chloe closed the laptop slowly. "Mom, what do you want to do with this?" Martha stared at the table for a moment, at the plates pushed aside, at the breadcrumbs left behind, at the open notepad with Chloe's handwriting covering half the page. "I don't know exactly yet," she said, "but I need to understand what's going on, and if it's what I think it is." Chloe said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I'll help you." It was that simple. And Martha knew, hearing those 3 words, said with the calm of someone who had already decided, that what had started on the 18th floor had found its way into her home. There was one person Martha knew could answer at least some of the questions piling up. A person who knew the city and its people in a way no computer file could replicate. Mrs. Dorothy Campbell had lived next door to Martha for 43 years. She was 71, with completely white hair she wore in a simple bun at the nape of her neck, and that way of moving and speaking of someone who was never in a hurry, because she learned early on that haste is the enemy of what matters. She had spent 28 years working at a notary office downtown, where she had processed an absurd volume of company registration documents, contracts, deeds, and transfers. She had retired 6 years earlier with the accumulated knowledge of someone who had seen the city change 3 times in her own hands. She was also the person who had stayed with Chloe on Tuesday afternoons when the girl was 12 and her mother had work meetings. The person who had taught Chloe how to make gingerbread and play checkers and tell a healthy plant from one that needed more water. The person who, when the scandal had destroyed Martha's life, had knocked on the door with a pot of soup and sat in the kitchen without needing to say anything special, just being there. On Saturday morning, Martha went over there with 2 coffees and a bag of cheddar biscuits she had bought at the corner bakery. Mrs. Campbell opened the door even before she knocked. "I saw your light on until almost 1 in the morning." She took one of the coffees. "Come in." Mrs. Campbell's house smelled of lavender and old books. There were plants everywhere, on the windowsills, on the shelves, in a tiny indoor garden she tended with a dedication that made it clear those plants weren't decoration for her. They were company. On the sofa, there was a ball of grey yarn and a half-finished knitting project, a sweater she was making for a friend's granddaughter. They sat at the kitchen table as they always did when there was a real matter to discuss. "Blackstone and Associates," Martha said after a sip of coffee. Mrs. Campbell set down her cup with a slow, deliberate movement. "I know the name. Do you know who's behind it?" The older woman looked at her for a moment, with those eyes that had the ability to see more than people usually wanted to show. "Arthur Blackstone is the lead partner," she said finally. "A lawyer. He worked at a big firm downtown before opening his own. A man in his 50s now, dark hair with white at the temples." She paused. "It was him, wasn't it? The person behind what happened to you?" Martha hadn't told Mrs. Campbell all the details at the time, but the neighbor was the kind of person who paid attention to the folds of stories, even when no one asked her to. "I believe so," Martha said. "But the name that appeared in the documents of the lawsuit filed against me was a company, not an individual. I never managed to get to him directly." Mrs. Campbell was quiet for a moment. From the indoor garden came the sound of a light breeze passing through the leaves. "There's something I never told you," she said. 2 years after what happened to you, another certified translator in the city had her license suspended. The story was similar to yours. Accusation of fraudulent documents, evidence presented, a quick trial. She looked at Martha. "I didn't tell you at the time because you had already left the field, and I didn't want to open a wound that seemed to be starting to heal. But I found out because the woman was an acquaintance of a colleague at the registry office." Martha felt her stomach tighten. "Do you know her name?" "Martha Jenkins. She worked for a downtown firm." Mrs. Campbell folded her hands on the table. "I don't know if she's still in the city, but I can try to find out." "Mrs. Campbell, do you think it's the same?" "I think you weren't the first or the last," the older woman said, with that direct clarity that only people who have seen a lot of life can have without sounding cruel. "And I think if there's any way to prove it, you should look into it." She picked up her cup again, but carefully. "Whoever did that to you once can do it again if they feel threatened." It was a warning Martha didn't need to hear to understand. But hearing it out loud, spoken by the woman who knew the silences and the edges of her life best, made everything more concrete in a way she needed it to be. The following Monday, something happened that she wasn't expecting. It was almost 10 at night, and she was finishing cleaning the hallway on the 18th floor when she heard footsteps behind her. Footsteps different from the usual ones, more hesitant, the kind that make an extra sound on the floor due to the uncertainty of someone who is going but isn't entirely sure they should be going. She turned around. He was one of the men from the meeting room the week before, the youngest in the group, the one who had stayed slightly apart from the others during the translation, the one who had had that expression she hadn't been able to fully identify at the time, and which now, looking straight at it, she recognized as the discomfort of someone seeing something they can't simply ignore. He was around 30, round, dark hair, an open face, a slightly loosened tie that suggested he was at the end of a long day. He looked both ways down the hall before speaking, checking they were alone. "My name is Tyler Brooks," he said, in a low voice. "I've been working with Harrison's team for 2 years. Martha didn't say anything. She waited. "When you read that contract last week," he continued, "I saw what you noticed. The part about the clauses. You stopped in the middle of reading and asked about the firm." He took a small breath. "I've been working with these documents for months, and there are structures inside them that have bothered me since I started, but that I never understood well enough to know if it was a real problem or if I was being paranoid." "So?" she said. The caution in her voice wasn't rudeness. It was simply the result of 6 years learning that premature generosity has a cost you pay later. "You recognize the pattern," he said. "And if you recognized it, it's because you've seen it before in another context." She studied him for a moment, The way he held his tie, slightly loosened from the knot, like someone who needed a physical gesture to match the decision he was making. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I need to know if I'm right about what I suspect." He paused. "And because if I am, I don't want to be part of it. Do you understand that by coming to me, you're putting yourself in a position?" "I understand." She kept looking at him for another moment. "I'm not going to promise you anything," she said. "But you can go on." Tyler took a deep breath. "I have images of contracts I've photographed over the last few months, on my phone with a password. I saved them because I felt they might be useful one day, without knowing exactly for what." He reached into his jacket pocket, but didn't take the device out yet. "If you agree to look, you can tell me if what I'm seeing matches what you noticed." "Bring them next week," she said. "Same time, same hallway." He nodded and walked back toward the elevator with those slightly hesitant steps from before. But now there was something different about them. They seemed more purposeful. Martha stared at where he had been until the hall was completely empty again. Then she went back to the cart. Prudence said not to trust. Experience said the same. But there was something in that young man's expression, in that specific discomfort of someone carrying a weight they didn't ask for, that she recognized because she had felt it for months before everything fell apart. She was going to look at the images, and then she was going to decide. She didn't tell Chloe about Tyler right away. She needed time to think, to evaluate, to understand what that meeting meant within the larger picture she was trying to piece together. But there was something else that had been rolling around in her head since the conversation with Mrs. Campbell, and that she decided to explore before anything else. Chloe had found Martha Jenkins's profile on a social network and had sent a message introducing herself as an accounting student, doing research on irregularities in professional records, a framework technical enough and vague enough not to raise alarm, but specific enough to get where it needed to go. The reply had come in less than 15 minutes. "Yes, I can. Whenever you want to talk." They scheduled it for the following Tuesday afternoon. Martha Jenkins lived in a quiet residential neighborhood, about a 20-minute bus ride from Martha Sullivan's house, a medium-sized house with a small porch where there was a swing and 3 pots with pink begonias. She received them at the door with a smile that faltered slightly when she saw that Chloe had brought her mother. "I didn't know you were bringing company," said Martha Jenkins. "Sorry I didn't warn you," Chloe said. "My mother has some context that might be relevant to the conversation." Martha Jenkins opened the door wider. "Come in." The living room was arranged with that kind of order that isn't decoration but necessity, the kind that comes from someone who went through a time when chaos took over and has since kept everything in place as a way to have control over something. There was a bookshelf full of books, most with bookmarks in the pages. There were photos on the walls, but none that she had stopped to look at carefully when she walked in. "I was a sworn translator," said Martha Sullivan, before any introductory or contextual conversation could begin. "My license was suspended 6 years ago. The office involved in the case against me was called, at the time, Blackstone and Associates." The smile that had remained on Martha Jenkins's face disappeared completely. "Come in and sit down," she said. The two Marthas talked for nearly 3 hours. Martha Jenkins' story paralleled Martha Sullivan's in a way that left Chloe taking notes with a slightly trembling hand. The same patterns, the same structure of accusation, the same speed at which the case had moved, the same practical impossibility of defending herself with the resources available. But there was one important difference. Martha Jenkins had kept all the documents from the case that had been filed against her. Every page, every notification, every technical opinion that had been submitted by the opposing party. And among those documents, there was something that Martha Sullivan hadn't expected to find. A technical opinion signed by an expert, hired by the opposing party. The kind of document that in such a case acts as the most important voice, the report that weighs more than any defense because it comes from someone presented as neutral and specialized. The expert's name was Tyler Brooks. He had been hired as an independent expert to evaluate Martha Jenkins' documentation, and his opinion had been the decisive factor in the license suspension case. "But there's something else," said Martha Jenkins, getting up and going to a drawer in the bookshelf. She returned with a folder yellowed by age. The professional address he used in that opinion, as an independent expert, was the same office that had drafted the contracts for the company that accused me. Martha Sullivan stared at the opinion. He was the technical expert in your case and the drafter of the opposing party's contracts at the same time. At the same time, confirmed Martha Jenkins. But nobody had noticed because at the time he was operating under a different name. Only 2 years later did he formally open Blackstone and Associates. There was a silence in the room that wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that happens when several people realize at the same time that the pieces of a story that seem disconnected have fallen into place. "Did you keep a copy of that opinion?" Chloe asked. "I have the original." Chloe looked at her mother. Martha Sullivan looked back. And between them passed the silent understanding that they had arrived somewhere that neither of them had reached alone. In the week that followed, Chloe spent almost every night poring over public notary records, searching for the line that connected the names and the dates. It was slow, repetitive work, requiring the patience of someone who knows that documents rarely give up everything at once. But when read carefully enough, they construct entire narratives. She had learned that in college, in an auditing module she had initially found tedious, and which now, suddenly, seemed to have been designed specifically for this moment. Business registration records, histories of corporate changes, archived contracts that became public after a certain period. Each name led to another. Each date opened a window to another date. One Saturday afternoon she called her mother over to the computer. "Look," she said, pointing at the screen with a pen. There was a line. Arthur Blackstone's previous firm, before the official opening of Blackstone and Associates, had provided legal consulting services to a company called Harrison Ventures. The company had been dissolved, but the contract history was archived. "He worked for Harrison," Martha said, more to herself than to her daughter. "For at least 7 years before you were accused," Chloe confirmed. "And look at the date of this specific contract." She clicked and opened a scanned file. It was a legal services contract between Blackstone's firm and Harrison Ventures. The date was the same month the lawsuit against Martha had been filed. Martha stared at the screen for a while without saying anything. There was the answer to the question she had carried inside herself for 6 years. The question that returned at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. Why her? Why specifically her, when there were other more well-known translators, larger companies? Because she had translated a contract for Harrison's company. A contract for importing equipment 6 years ago, which she had delivered with technical notes in the margins, as was her professional habit. Notes that had precisely identified the type of clause she had recognized in the meeting room. The notes had gone along with the translation, delivered to the client as part of the service she always provided, because she thought it was a good translator's responsibility not just to convert words, but to point out what deserved attention. Someone had read those notes, had realized she knew what she was seeing, and had acted before she could do anything with that knowledge. She hadn't been chosen by coincidence. She had been silenced because she was dangerous to someone. "Chloe," she said, her voice calmer than she expected it to come out, "I need the copy of the contract I translated for Harrison's company 6 years ago." "You still have it?" "I do. In the cardboard box in the closet." Opening that box carried a weight Martha had put off for 6 years. It was a reinforced cardboard box, its lid sealed with tape that had yellowed, stored at the back of the closet behind a blanket she no longer used. She had carried it to the new house without opening it, like someone carrying a suitcase they don't want to unpack, because they know it will hurt to see what's inside. It was almost 11 at night when she dragged the box to the center of the room, sat on the floor beside it, and slowly peeled off the tape. Inside was the past, a whole life of professional documents, service contracts with clients, copies of delivered translations, payment receipts, certificates and diplomas that had been taken off the office wall after the shutdown and stored there because there was nowhere else to put them. It took nearly an hour to find what she was looking for, the service contract with Harrison Ventures, date 6 years and 4 months ago. And along with the contract, the copy of the translation she had delivered, with the handwritten technical notes in the margins. Her small, precise handwriting in blue, pointing out the clauses that needed revision before any signature. And at the bottom of the folder, the email confirmation receipt, showing that the translation with annotations had been sent to the client company's address. The address was for Harrison Ventures. She stared at that paper for a long time in the silence of her room. Then she carefully placed everything inside a new folder that Chloe had bought to organize the documents. Every paper in its place, every date visible. It was late when she finished, but she wasn't sleepy. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to drop a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us beginners. Now, continuing. The following Monday, Tyler found her in the hallway as they had arranged. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and turned the screen toward her without saying a word. Martha scrolled through the images slowly, one by one, paying close attention to each photographed page. There were 15 different contracts at various stages of signing. In 7 of them she identified the structure she had recognized in the lobby, the gradual transfer of responsibility to a secondary signer, drafted with subtle variations but sharing the same underlying logic. In 3 of the contracts, the secondary signer was identified only by a registration number, with no visible name on the photographed pages. "Do you know who signs as the secondary signer in those?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "I don't have direct access to that information. The contracts are presented already in the final stages, and the secondary signer section is in a part that only the main partners can access." He paused. "But I can check the physical files. There are paper documents that don't exist in any digital system." "Tyler," she said, looking him straight in the eye, "before you go deep into this, I need you to understand something. I know the history of these people. They've seen someone catch on to what you're catching on to, and when that happened, they didn't waste any time acting." He stared at the shiny hallway floor. "You're telling me to be careful. I'm telling you to make sure you want to keep going." There was a silence as he weighed that. "I've already tried not to keep going," he said finally. "I can't. There are things you can't pretend you didn't see." She understood. That was exactly how her own technical notes on that contract had sounded 6 years ago. The inability to see an irregularity and simply let it slide. "Then be careful," she said, "and don't talk to anyone else about this but me." That same week, Chloe reached out to a college professor who had been mentioned in a seminar on contract irregularities. Professor Winston Abernathy was 56 years old and had spent nearly 15 of them as an expert in corporate contracts before moving into teaching. He was the kind of man who spoke little, but with absolute precision, who didn't confirm what he hadn't verified, but when he did confirm, he did so with the weight of someone who had the foundation for it. Chloe had sent a summary of the situation by message. The reply came that same afternoon. "You can send me the documentation. I'll analyze it before any meeting." 3 days of waiting followed while Winston analyzed what he had received. 3 days in which Martha went to work as usual, pushed the cart down the same hallways, cleaned the same restrooms, and waited with the patience she had learned the hard way over 6 years of life. The message came on a Thursday night. "There is a consistent pattern. I need to see the original documents in person. When can you?" The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the small office Winston kept at the college. In Winston Abernathy's office, with law contract books stacked everywhere and a window overlooking the inner courtyard where students passed by, Martha Sullivan spread the documents across the table with the same calm she had used to organize them the night before. Martha Jenkins was beside her with her own folder, Chloe Sullivan on the other side with the scanned files on her laptop. Winston listened to everything without interrupting. He took notes on a paper pad with a blue pen, went back to pages, compared dates, held documents up to the window light with that focused attention of someone looking for something specific. When the 3 women finished presenting, he stayed silent for almost 2 minutes. A silence that felt longer than it was because it was filled with things being weighed. "The pattern is clear," he said finally. "I've seen similar structures throughout my career, but rarely with such coherent documentation connecting the cases." He looked at Martha Sullivan. What you have here is enough to support a request to review your record. To directly hold the parties involved responsible for what happened to you, the path would be a separate and much longer process. For now, I just need the record, said Martha. The rest is a matter that goes beyond me. Winston nodded. There is a route for reviewing record suspensions in cases where later evidence suggests irregularities in the original process. It's bureaucratic, it takes time, but it's solid. He gathered the papers he had set aside. I'll guide you on how to start that request, but I need one more thing. What? An independent reviewer to evaluate the material and issue a technical note before you submit the formal request. That substantially strengthens your position. I know someone who worked on similar cases. I can get in touch. Go ahead, said Martha, and for the first time in 6 years, there was a real path ahead of her. Not a vague hope, not a distant possibility. A path with concrete steps and concrete people and documents that existed and could be presented. It was enough to start breathing differently. The problem came from where she expected it. Gus, her supervisor at the cleaning company, called her in on a Thursday morning to the small office in the basement of the building, where he handled shift logistics and supplies. He had the expression of someone who received bad news and didn't exactly know how to deliver it. I got a call, he said, not looking at her at first. About your previous professional background. Martha said nothing. She waited. Someone suggested I check your records more carefully, that there were irregularities in your history that would be relevant to the company. Did you check? She asked calmly. I did. He finally looked at her. The form you filled out when you were hired had no question about professional history in another field. What happened with your translator license has nothing to do with the work you do here. He paused. But I have to ask, are you having any problem with someone in the Coastal Plaza building? She could have dodged it. She could have said she didn't know what it was about. But Gus had defended her without her asking, and that deserved honesty. There's a person who would prefer I wasn't on that floor, she said. For personal reasons not related to the job. Can I ask why? It's an old matter I'm trying to resolve. It doesn't cause any problem for the company, I give you my word. Gus looked at her for a moment. Then he lightly tapped his palm on the desk. Your word is enough for me. But stay alert. People like that don't give up easily. She left the office and stood for a moment in the basement hallway, the neon light buzzing faintly above her head. Sterling Harrison had tried to take her down through her work. He had failed because of the integrity of a middle-aged, overweight man who tapped his pen on the desk when he was nervous. But failure wasn't going to stop him. It was going to make him try another way. She needed to be faster. That night she told Chloe what had happened. Chloe listened with her arms crossed and her jaw slightly tense. Mom, we need to speed everything up. It's not just about the registry anymore. He's trying to get you fired from the only job you have right now. I know. Send the rest of the documents to Professor Abernathy today. Chloe stood up and went to get the folder of documents. And I need to tell you something I didn't mention before, because I wasn't sure yet. Martha waited. I mapped out the contracts Tyler photographed. In 2 cases, I managed to identify who the secondary signatories would be from the registration numbers on the documents, cross-referencing them with public information. She opened the folder. Both are small suppliers, individuals, or micro-enterprises. In both cases, the liability clauses they signed would put them in a position to take on obligations far beyond what any supplier of their size could handle. Martha looked at her daughter. Did they sign? One already signed, the other hasn't yet. There's a meeting scheduled for next week. A new weight settled in the room. Chloe, Martha said slowly, if that supplier signs without knowing what he's taking on— I know, said Chloe. We need to do something. It was Winston Abernathy who found the way. When Martha explained the situation of the supplier who was about to sign, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said there was a possibility. As a specialized professor of contract law, he had relationships with several professionals in the field around the region. Someone mutually trusted could, without citing specific sources, recommend to the supplier that they request a technical review of the contract before signing. It was the kind of advice any good lawyer would give any client before an important signing. It wouldn't be a complaint. It wouldn't be an exposure. It would simply be one professional advising another that it was worth checking before signing. The connection was made through an intermediary, discreet, with enough degrees of separation to protect everyone involved. 3 days later, Tyler sent a one-word message: cancelled. The supplier had asked for time for an additional review. The contract had been suspended. The signing meeting had been cancelled without a formal explanation. Martha stared at that message on her cell phone as she sat on the bus heading home, still in her uniform, her bag on her lap. Outside, the city passed by at the speed of weeknights, streetlights and sidewalks and lit windows. She hadn't made a speech. She hadn't confronted anyone. She had used what she always had: knowledge, attention, the ability to see what others thought impossible for her to see. And she had used it to protect someone who didn't even know they needed protection. For a moment, there on the bus, smelling of hot air and tired people, she allowed herself to feel something she had held back for a long time. It wasn't revenge. It was something cleaner than that. It was the feeling that what had been done to her was no longer just destroying. It was being reversed, slowly, without fanfare, but real. Sterling Harrison found out about the cancellation the next day. Martha didn't know how he had found out so quickly, but the effect was visible even from a distance. She arrived at work the next morning, and the atmosphere on the 18th floor had shifted in a way she sensed more than saw. Quieter voices, more guarded people, meetings that used to happen in the hallway now took place behind closed doors. Tyler had vanished from the floor. She found out later from an overheard conversation between 2 employees in the hallway that he had taken emergency leave and no one knew when he would return. It was a bad sign. But it also meant he had time to do what he needed to do before leaving. On Thursday of that same week, she found a folded envelope wedged under the handle of the staff locker in the basement, with her name written in small letters and no signature. Inside was a sheet folded in 4 with a single line written, "File C7 on the physical server, second cabinet in room 1802. Bring a camera." She burned the paper in the bathroom and washed the ash down the drain. There was no camera available to her, but there was her phone with enough resolution to document whatever was necessary. And there was the night of the Friday shift, when the floor usually emptied out earlier. On Friday, she waited. She did her rounds with her usual calm, room by room, corridor by corridor. When she reached room 1802, a rarely used file room whose key hung on a hook in the staff break room, she had her phone in her apron pocket and her heart beating at a pace she had decided not to let show in her breathing. The room was dark. She turned on the small corner light, just enough not to attract attention through the crack in the door. The second cabinet was unlocked. In the folder marked C7, there were printouts of internal emails. Not many, just 6 pages. But what was on those 6 pages was enough to make her stand still for a moment before starting to photograph them. The emails were exchanges between Sterling Harrison and the firm Blackstone & Associates, covering a period of 2 years. The content was technical, but there was one specific email sent 6 years and 4 months ago that mentioned the name of a certified translator who had raised technical issues in a confidential client document, and the need to resolve the situation before it caused complications in closing the deal. The name was hers. Martha Sullivan, certified translator, had raised issues, needed to be resolved. She photographed all 6 pages, checked that every image was legible, turned off the small light, closed the cabinet, left the room and locked the door with the key she had taken from the break room. Then she went to the nearest restroom, sat on the closed toilet lid, and stayed there for about 3 minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, just breathing. She sent the images to Chloe that same night. Chloe stayed up until 2 in the morning, printing and organizing. Early Saturday morning, they sat at the kitchen table with the new material alongside everything else they had gathered. "Does this change the weight of the review request?" Martha asked. "A lot," said Chloe. "Until now, we had documents that suggested a pattern. Now we have an email that mentions you by name, 6 years ago, the week the lawsuit against you was filed. Professor Winston needs to see this today." Chloe already had her phone in hand. Winston Abernathy replied in less than an hour. He asked them to send the files through a secure channel he had indicated in an earlier meeting. He analyzed the material over the afternoon and sent a message at 7 in the evening. This changes the assessment. I'll contact the reviewer tomorrow morning. The reviewer, who had received the original material weeks earlier and had asked for extra time to analyze it, issued a supplementary note in less than a week. The note was technical, sober, without drama. But what it said was clear. There was enough documentary evidence to support that the original suspension of registration process had been based on elements that presented an undeclared conflict of interest on the technical side. That was all she needed. The formal request for review was submitted in a protocol at the end of that week. Martha filed it in person, with Chloe beside her, on a Tuesday morning when she had swapped shifts to have the time free. As she left the service counter with the protocol receipt in hand, she folded the paper carefully and placed it in the same bag where she had put the little notebook so many nights ago. What came next was the hardest weight of all. Not because there was uncertainty. The path was clearer than it had been at any point in the last 6 years. There was solid documentation, an independent reviewer, and an experienced professional like Winston guiding every step. The difficulty was something else. It was the weight of waking up every day to the same hallway, the same cart, the same uniform, knowing what had been done, and that the resolution now depended on processes and timelines beyond her control. It was crossing paths with Sterling Harrison once a week in the elevator or hallway and keeping her expression completely neutral. It was watching the changes on the floor without knowing if they were reactions to what had happened or just the normal movement of any company. Tyler hadn't come back from vacation. After a few days, she received a short message from him. "I quit. New job at a smaller accounting firm far from here. I'm doing okay." She replied that he had done the right thing. He responded with a sentence she reread several times in the following days. "I only did what anyone should do when they know what's right. The hard part was getting there." It was a simple sentence, but she knew it from the inside. It had taken her 6 years to get there. For Tyler, it had taken 2. Neither of them had gotten there quickly, and maybe that was exactly why what they had done had worked. It hadn't been impulsive. It had been built slowly, carefully, with the resources each of them had available. Mrs. Campbell stopped by on a Thursday afternoon with a piece of cornbread she had made that morning, and with that way of sitting down at the table as if she had all day, like people who have learned that time doesn't need to be filled to have value. "How much longer?" she asked. "Winston says cases like this usually take 2 to 4 months. It's been a month and a half." Mrs. Campbell nodded slowly. "You know what's hard to learn with age?" she said. Martha looked up from her coffee. "That waiting isn't wasting time." The older woman picked up her fork. "We spend our whole lives thinking waiting is the same as standing still. It's not. Sometimes it's the most active thing there is." She cut a piece of the cornbread. "You're waiting right. The difference between waiting and wasting time is knowing what you're waiting for. It was the kind of simple thing that seems obvious and yet arrives in a way that nothing obvious does." "Have you been through this?" Martha asked. "Waiting for something beyond your control?" Mrs. Campbell stared out the window for a moment. "I waited 20 years for my son to understand some things about me," she said. "I started to think it would never happen." She brought her gaze back. "But it did, on his time, not mine. And when it came for real." Martha looked at her neighbor for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "For the cornbread," Mrs. Campbell corrected with a smile. "For the cornbread, too." Chloe spent the following weeks with a focus Martha had never seen in her before. It was as if the process of gathering documents, cross-referencing information, organizing what she had found, had awakened something in her that college had been preparing, but needed a real cause to become genuine skill. She had gone beyond what Martha had asked. She had put together a complete timeline, from Blackstone's first company to his work as a third-party process specialist, through the formal opening of Blackstone and Associates, and up to the recent contracts photographed by Tyler. She had highlighted in different colors the points of overlap, the dates that matched, the names that appeared in more than one place. It was an accountant's work, patient, methodical, skipping no steps. "When you graduate," Martha said one night, looking at the mapping Chloe had set up on the table, "do you want to work in auditing?" Chloe looked at the material she had produced. "Maybe," she said. But first I want to finish college. She closed the folder. And after all this is settled, I want to take a whole weekend just to sleep. Martha laughed. It was a small laugh, but it came from a real place. I'll buy you breakfast, she said. I'll take you up on that. The letter arrived on a Friday afternoon. Martha was on her shift when her phone buzzed in her pocket with a message from Chloe. Mum, a letter came. You need to see this. I didn't open it, I'm home. She finished the floor carefully, put away her supplies with the same attention as always, took the service elevator down, and left through the back of the building. The bus took 11 minutes. She counted. The letter was on the kitchen table when she got there, an envelope with thick paper, the official stamp printed in the upper corner. Chloe was standing near the sink with her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes on the envelope. Mrs. Dorothy Campbell was sitting at the table. Chloe had called her without telling her mum, because some things need a witness. Martha walked in, took her bag off her shoulder, looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. She read the first line, then the second. Then she went back to the beginning and reread everything from the start slowly to make sure she understood what was written. The request for review was approved, she said, with that voice that comes out when your throat is straining, not to show what's happening underneath. The suspension of my license was deemed unfounded. She took a breath. My license is reinstated. Chloe covered her mouth with her hand for a second. Then she went toward her mom and hugged her the way you hug when the bill is 6 years old, when the hug has to carry too much time to fit in a single position. Martha stood with her arms around her daughter and her eyes closed. Mrs. Dorothy Campbell said nothing. She stayed where she was with that small, steady smile of someone who knew, who had always known this would happen and had waited patiently for the only moment when it was right to say she had known, when there was no longer any possible doubt. Martha didn't quit that Friday. It was late. She was tired in a good way she hadn't felt in a long time, and there were decisions that needed to be made calmly rather than at the speed of emotion. But on Saturday morning, while having coffee with Chloe before going to the market, she said, "I'm going to give my notice on Monday." Chloe nodded. "I figured. And I'm going to call Martha Jenkins today." Chloe looked at her over the cup. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" "I am." The idea had come to her on one of those waiting nights, when Martha had been staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what life would be like afterward. Two sworn translators with complementary experiences and parallel histories, rebuilding together what had been undone by the same hands. It wasn't romanticism. It was simple logic. What each would take years to build alone, together they had a different starting point. Martha Jenkins had answered the phone on the second ring, like someone who was waiting for the call without knowing it. "I was thinking about you this week," she said upon hearing Martha Sullivan's voice. "I have a proposal," said Martha. There was a silence on the other end. Then, "Tell me." On Monday, Martha arrived at work at her usual time. She did the first floor, then the second, reached the 18th, worked the entire hallway with the same attention as always. When she went to put away the supplies at the end of her shift, she passed by the company's reception in the basement and asked for a moment with Gus. He received her with the expression of someone who was already expecting it, because people who pay attention usually know before being told. "I'm here to give notice," she said. "Going where?" "Going back to my field. I'm reopening the office." Gus looked at her for a moment. There was something in that look that wasn't just the surprise of someone losing a good employee. It was the recognition of someone who had been in a place that wasn't theirs and is now going where they always should have been. "Good luck," he said, standing up to shake her hand, "and thank you for the work." It was always quality work. She left the basement and walked to the service exit, where she had entered and left so many hundreds of times over the past 6 years. Before leaving, she stopped. She looked at the long basement hallway, at the stacked supply boxes, at the neon lights on the ceiling, at the place that had been her ground when she had no other. Then she turned and left. The new office started in a room of Martha's house that Chloe had helped organize on a Saturday afternoon, with an enthusiasm she tried to disguise by calling it practicality. A big table that had been at a neighborhood garage sale. 2 computers, a laser printer that Chloe had found barely used for a decent price, a shelf for the technical dictionaries and manuals that Martha had started gathering over the past few weeks. Martha Jenkins came in as a partner from day one. She arrived on a Monday morning with a box of cookies and that look in her eyes of someone doing something that should have been done long ago. The first client came through Winston Abernathy, who had recommended the two to a colleague needing translations of partnership contracts with external suppliers. It was a medium-sized job with a 2-week deadline. They delivered in 10 days, with revision included. The thank you email from the client had only 2 lines. Excellent work. You can count on our future demand. Martha Sullivan printed the email, folded it, and placed it in a new folder she had bought specifically to keep the milestones of what was being rebuilt. It was a new, conscious habit. The past had stayed in the cardboard box. The future deserved a different folder. There was one loose end that resolved itself in a way Martha hadn't planned. The emails that Tyler had left in the file on the 18th floor had reached, through a path she never fully tracked, one of the partners at Blackstone and Associates itself. A partner who had joined the firm 2 years ago and who had been uncomfortable with certain practices he observed but had never found enough concrete evidence to act on. The partner started an internal audit that Martha followed from afar through news that came via Winston without getting directly involved. The result was an internal process that was still ongoing when she opened the new office. She didn't know what would come of that process. It was no longer her battle to fight. There were other people better positioned with other resources to take it wherever it needed to go. She had started the movement, and sometimes that's all it is, starting the movement, and trusting that what's in motion will find its way. Sterling Harrison had been quieter in recent weeks. There were rumors of changes in the business group that Winston had mentioned in passing during a conversation, without details she needed to know. She didn't ask further. It was no longer necessary. On a Saturday afternoon, almost 5 months after that Tuesday on the 18th floor, Chloe arrived home with the results of a test, the highest grade in the class for corporate contracts. She placed the paper on the table with that expression that mixed pride with a way of not wanting to make a big deal out of it, as if it were natural, as if it hadn't cost entire nights of studying after full days of work. Martha looked at the grade, then at her daughter. "You're going to be excellent," she said. "I learned from the best," Chloe replied. It was a simple afternoon. There were 2 glasses of juice on the table that Chloe had set out because she was hot. There was a fan running in the hallway. There was the sound of Mrs. Dorothy watering the plants in the garden next door, the familiar noise of the hose hitting the ground. Martha picked up the glass of juice. "Cheers," she said. Chloe raised her glass. "Cheers, Mom." There were 6 years inside that gesture. There were midnight buses and cleaning carts and black and white uniforms and waxed hallways. There was a night when 5 men had laughed at her, and she had responded with the only thing that had always been hers, and that no one had ever truly taken away: what she knew, and the patience to know when to use it. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story, and where you're watching us from. Do you believe Martha's patience was her most powerful weapon? Leave your opinion in the comments. We really want to hear what you think. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories like this one.